history video. This was a requested topic. I unfortunately don't have to hand who it was who requested it, but you know who you are. So of course, if you have any recommendations for historical topics, events, time periods, etc., then be sure to leave them in the comments down below. But I reckon let's just get straight into the history of D-Day. So, the Normandy invasion, also called Operation Overlord or D-Day, during World War II was the Allied invasion of Western Europe, which was launched on June 6, 1944, the most celebrated D-Day of the war, with the simultaneous landing of US, British and Canadian forces on 5 separate beachheads in Normandy, France. By the end of August 1944, all of northern France was liberated and the invading forces reorganised for the drive into Germany, where they would eventually meet with Soviet forces advancing from the east to bring an end to the Nazi Reich. So, we begin with the planning from 1941 to 43. Hitler's Reich, east and west. In midsummer 1943, a year before the Anglo-American invasion of Normandy that would lead to the liberation of Western Europe, Adolf Hitler's Wehrmacht armed forces still occupied all the territory it had gained in the Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 to 41, and most of its Russian conquests of 1941 to 42. It also retained its foothold on the coast of North Africa, acquired when it had gone to the aid of its Italian ally in 1941. The Russian counter-offensives at the Battle of Stalingrad and the Battle of Kursk had pushed back the perimeter of Hitler's Europe in the east, yet he or his allies still controlled the whole of mainland Europe, except for neutral Spain, Portugal, Switzerland and Sweden. The Nazi war economy, though overshadowed by the growing power of America's, outmatched both of Britain and that of the Soviet Union, except in the key areas of tank and aircraft production. Without direct intervention by the Western Allies on the continent, an intervention that would centre on the commitment of a large American army, Hitler could count on prolonging his military dominance for years to come. The Second Front. Since 1942, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin had been pressing his allies, US President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, to mount a second front in the West. It was impossible in these circumstances. America's army was still forming, while the landing craft necessary to bring such an army across the English Channel had not yet been built. I keep having to cut because it's actually thundering, so that's fantastic. Nevertheless, Britain had begun to prepare theoretical plans for a return to the continental mainland soon after the retreat from Dunkirk, France in 1940, and the Americans immediately after Hitler declared war on the US on December 11, 1941, had started to frame their own timetable. Less inhibited than the British by perceived technical difficulties, the Americans pressed from the start for an early invasion, desirably in 1943, perhaps even in 1942. To that end, George C. Marshall, Roosevelt's chief of staff, appointed a protege, Dwight Eisenhower, to the US Army's War Plans Division in December 1941, and commissioned him to design an operational scheme for Allied victory. And that brings us into Operations Roundup and Sledgehammer. Swiftly convincing himself that the priority of Germany first, agreed to by Roosevelt and Churchill in the Atlantic Charter, was correct, Eisenhower framed proposals for a 1943 invasion, Operation Roundup, and another for 1942, Operation operation Sledgehammer. In the event of a Russian collapse or a sudden weakening of Germany's position, that is. Both plans were presented to the British in London in April 1942, and Roundup was adopted. The British nevertheless reserved objective doubts, and at subsequent Anglo-American conferences in Washington in June, in London in July, they first quashed all thought of Sledgehammer and then succeeded in persuading the Americans to agree to a North African landing as the principal operation of 1942. Operation Torch, as the landing in North Africa was to be codenamed, effectively postponed Roundup again, while subsequent operations in Sicily and the Italian mainland delayed preparations for the cross-channel invasion through 1943 as well. The postponements were a principal cause for concern at inter-allied conferences at Washington, codenamed Trident, May 1943, Quebec, Cairo and Tehran. At the last gathering, Roosevelt and Stalin combined against Churchill to insist on the adoption of May 1944 as an unalterable date for the invasion. In return, Stalin agreed to mount a simultaneous offensive in Eastern Europe and to join in the war against Japan once Germany had been defeated. So that takes us to Operation Overlord. The decision taken at Tehran was a final indication of American determination to stage the cross-channel invasion. It was also a defeat for Alan Brooke, Churchill's chief of staff and the principal opponent of premature action. Yet despite Brooke's procrastination, the British had in fact been proceeding with structural plans coordinated by Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan, who had been appointed Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander at the Anglo-American Casablanca Conference in January 1943. His staff's first plan for Operation Overlord was for a landing in Normandy, between Cayenne and the Cotentin Peninsula, in a strength of 3 divisions, with 2 brigades to be airdropped. Another 11 divisions were to be landed within the first 2 weeks through 2 artificial harbours that would be towed across the channel. Once a foothold had been established, a force of 100 divisions, the majority shipped directly from the United States, were to be assembled in France for a final assault on Germany. In January 1944, Eisenhower became Supreme Allied Commander, and the Cossack Staff was redesignated Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. So, D-Day, June 6, 1944, the decision to go. May 1944 had been chosen at the conference in Washington in May 1943 as the time for invasion. Difficulties in assembling landing craft forced a postponement until June, but June 5th was fixed as an unalterable date by Eisenhower on May 17th. As the day approached and troops began to embark for the crossing, bad weather set in, threatening dangerous landing conditions. After tense debate, Eisenhower and his subordinates decided on a 24-hour delay, requiring the recall of some ships already at sea. Eventually, on the morning of June 5th, Eisenhower, assured by Chief Meteorologist James Martin Stagg Special Task Force also captured key bridges over the Cayenne Canal and Orne River. When the seaborne units began to land at about 6:30 a.m. on June 6th, the British and Canadians on Gold, Juno and Sword beaches overcame light opposition. So did the Americans at Utah. The US 1st Division at Omaha Beach, however, confronted the best of the German coast divisions, the 352nd, and was roughly handled by machine gunners as the troops waded ashore. During the morning, the landing at Omaha threatened to fail. Only dedicated local leadership eventually got the troops inland, though at a cost of more than 2,000 casualties. The German response. Meanwhile, the German High Command, in the absence of Rommel, who was home on leave, began to respond. Hitler was initially unwilling to release the armoured divisions for a counterattack. When he relented after midday, elements of the 21st Panzer Division drove into the gap between the British 3rd and Canadian 3rd Divisions at Sword Beach and Juno Beach, and almost reached the sea. Had they done so, the landings might have failed. Fierce resistance by the British anti-tank gunners at Pierre-sur-l'Étang turned the tide in the late evening. The lodgement area established, so on June 7th, the beachhead consisted of 3 separate sectors: that of the British and Canadians between Cayenne and Bayeux, that of the US 5 Corps between Port-au-Bessin and Saint-Pierre-des-Monts, my French pronunciation's coming out here, and that of the US 7th Corps west of the Fire River behind Utah Beach. The narrow gap between Gold and Omaha at Port-au-Bessin was quickly closed, but it was not until June 12th that the American Corps were able to join hands after a bitter battle to capture Carentan. The beachhead then formed a continuous zone, its deepest point being southwest of Bayeux, where the 5th Corps had driven nearly 15 miles inland. Meanwhile, work had been proceeding pell-mell to complete 2 artificial harbours, known by their code name Mulberry, that were intended to offload vehicles and supplies until the port of Cherbourg was secured. An outer breakwater of sunken ships for each harbour was in place by June 11th. Floating piers designed to rise and fall with the tides were half finished by June 19th, when a heavy storm destroyed much of the material. The Americans then decided to abandon their Mulberry, while the British harbour was not in use until July. Most supplies, meanwhile, had to be beach-landed by assorted landing craft, landing ships and amphibious trucks. The next section is titled Stalemate from June to July 1944. Fighting in the Bocage. Fighting inshore, the Allies also encountered difficulty in the dense hedgerow country known to the French as the Bocage. Thanks to the success of the airborne landings, the flanks of the beachhead were firmly held, but efforts to break out of the centre were frustrated by fierce German resistance and counterattacks, particularly around Cayenne in the British-Canadian sector. A British armoured thrust at Villers-Bocage was defeated on June 13th. A large-scale infantry offensive west of Cayenne called Operation Epsom was also defeated on June 25th to 29th. There was gloom at SHAEF. It seemed that stalemate was descending. The gloom was deepened by Montgomery base strategy. His plan was to draw German armour toward the British front and win a battle of attrition between tank forces. The successful German defence, however, led the Americans to doubt the plan's viability. In fact, the Germans were also depressed, for their bitter defence was using up men and equipment that could not be replaced. Moreover, the Americans were now able to profit from the deployment of most of the enemy's armour against the British and break into the base of the Cotentin Peninsula and advance on Cherbourg. The last bastion in the heavily fortified city fell on June 28th, and clearance of the port began at once. Crisis in the German command. The setbacks brought about a crisis in the German High Command, which in any case now suffered unforeseeable casualties. Dolman, commander of the 7th Army, died suddenly on June 28th, just after the surrender of the main garrison in Cherbourg. His death was blamed on a heart attack, though it is quite likely he committed suicide. Rommel was severely injured when his car was strafed by a British fighter on July 17th. Worst of all, Rundstedt confessed defeatism to Hitler, urged him to make peace, and was dismissed on July 2nd, along with Gere, the commander of Panzer Group West. Gere was replaced by the capable veteran Heinrich Eberbach. Rundstedt himself was replaced by Günther von Kluge, who soon came round to sharing Rundstedt's doubts. On July 20th, a conspiracy of officers who believed the only hope of securing peace lay in Hitler's removal made an attempt on his life at East Prussian headquarters in Rastenburg. The failure of the July plot led to Hitler's taking draconian powers over the army and exacting terrible revenge on those suspected of complicity. Rommel was forced to commit suicide in October, and Kluge did so on August 18th. The German defence of Normandy had then taken a turn for the worse. Though a large British armoured offensive west of Cayenne, Operation Goodwood, failed on July 18th to 19th, the US First Army conducted a bitter battle of attrition around Saint-Lô in the 2nd and 3rd weeks of July. Its success was to lay the basis for the long-awaited breakout. August 1944. Beginning with Operation Cobra. By July 25th, with most of the German tanks drawn westward by the British Goodwood offensive, the Americans faced a front almost denuded of armour. Reinforcement gave them a clear superiority in tank and infantry divisions, while the Allied Expeditionary Force had the bombardment power to devastate the Germans in their path. Operation Cobra was scheduled for July 25th, opened with a devastating air attack. Through the gap thus opened, the US First Army sped toward Avranches, taken on July 30th. At this point, George S. Patton's newly formed Third Army joined in the advance. A massive American spearhead now threatened to drive into Brittany, and by a left turn to encircle the Germans in Normandy from the rear. The German counterattack and the Falaise pocket. Hitler saw the breakout as an opportunity to restore the front, bringing the 2nd, 116th and 1st and 2nd Panzer SS divisions hastily westward. He issued orders for Operation Lüttich, designed to drive behind the point of the American spearhead and reach the sea at Avranches. However, ultra-interceptions of German cipher traffic alerted the Americans to the danger, Riviera, Hitler at last recognised the inevitable and gave permission for a withdrawal from Normandy. The only route of escape lay through a gap between the converging American and British spearheads at Valais. The position was held by the recently arrived Polish 1st Armoured Division. Despite its heroic efforts, the remnants of the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army, the latter now led by one of Hitler's top tank commanders, succeeded in breaking through between August 16th and 19th. Some 240,000 men, bereft of equipment, eventually reached the Seine River. They left behind in Normandy some 50,000 dead and 200,000 taken prisoner. And we end with the liberation of Paris, as Model drew the retreating Germans back across northern France at breakneck speed into Belgium. Resistance forces in Paris rose against what remained of the German garrison there on August 19th. Fighting broke out, and as news of the struggle reached the public in America and Britain, Eisenhower reversed his earlier decision to bypass the capital. The recently arrived Free French 2nd Armored Division was ordered to liberate the city. Its vanguards arrived on August 24th. Next morning, the German city commander Dietrich von Choltitz surrendered to the resistance and to Jacques Philippe Leclerc, the 2nd Armoured Commander. On August 26th, General Charles de Gaulle, head of the Free French, made a triumphal parade down the Champs-Élysées to Notre Dame Cathedral, where a mass of victory was celebrated. Liberation had come at a high cost. More than 200,000 dead, wounded and missing from the Allied armies. More than 300,000 from the German. French civilian losses numbered more than 12,000. Still, the Normandy campaign had been a stunning success. By early September 1944, all but a fraction of France had been liberated. The US, British and Canadian forces had occupied Belgium and part of the Netherlands and had reached the German frontier. They had, however, outrun their logistical support and lacked the strength to launch a culminating offensive. The coming winter would see much hard fighting, and a German counter-offensive in the Belgian Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, before the German army in the west was finally to be beaten. And that was the history of D-Day. Obviously, as I kind of say with all of our history topics, we could go properly in depth for hours, but when I'm sort of doing research and picking bits from websites, I have to be quite selective to keep the videos between 20 and 30 minutes, otherwise I wouldn't be able to produce enough content. But if you have any really interesting facts about D-Day that weren't covered and you'd like to share them, feel free to comment them down below. I feel like with war stuff we tend to do quite sort of linear tellings of events. I think in coming history videos I'd like to sort of visit and take a look at direct accounts from soldiers, so like diary entries, letters, homes, things like that. I think that would be really interesting. Let me know if that's something you'd be interested in. But that is going to do it for tonight's video. I hope you found the rain sounds ideally relaxing, but if not too off-putting. It wasn't really raining when I sat down to record, but that is always the way things go. But a reminder to leave any suggestions for videos in the comments down below. But that is going to do